I think the board actually approved a BAMD combined
Chair
pipeline.
Kenyanya, we are live in the boardroom. You can go ahead and start the meeting.
I'm so sorry.
Thank you, Jason. Good morning, everyone. To my colleagues there at McNamara, those on Zoom, and others watching on the live stream. I call to order this meeting of the Audit and Compliance Committee of the Regents of the University of Minnesota. Two quick items before we turn to our agenda. First, I'd like to welcome our student representatives. First, we have Gertie Johal and Flora Yang. They're both from the Twin Cities campus. Thank you both for your time and service and for being with us this morning. Second, we have a change in the order of our agenda today. We will swap items 2 and 3. Other items will remain the same. And with that, we'll turn to our agenda. The first item is a review of our external auditor relationships and the services provided by them. Joining us are Associate Vice President Mike Volna and Molly Viola, our Director of Accounting Services. I see they're getting settled, and once they're settled, the floor is theirs. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Kenyanya. Members of the committee, good morning. It's nice to see you. I'd like to open by sending regrets on behalf of Senior Vice President Franz, who's attending an important civic event in Minneapolis on behalf of the president, and also our controller, Sue Paulson, who was called away unexpectedly for a family matter out of state. So you get me this morning, and I apologize for that. I'd like to start off by sort of just giving you a couple opening remarks on this. This report supports the board's reservation of authority to engage audit firms. It should be viewed sort of together in the context with your individual approvals that you do throughout the year on engagements with audit firms. And together, those two functions help ensure that you're engaging firms in a manner which preserves their independence and therefore frees them of any apparent conflict of interest, which is important to us because we want to ensure that our auditors are perceived as well as in fact independent so that their reports can be trusted and relied upon. So with that context, I'll turn it over to our Director of Accounting, Molly Viola, who will walk you through the report.
Good morning, Chair Kenyanya and committee members. It is my pleasure to be here this morning to provide an overview of both audit and non-audit services provided by external audit firms for the fiscal year 21. This discussion, as Mike Volna shared with you, is intended to provide committee members with information that will aid in your ability to fulfill your obligations to assess the performance of the university's external auditor, as well as provide oversight of engagements with other audit firms, which is required by board operations and agenda guidelines. The information I will be sharing with you today is included in your docket materials beginning on page 3. And I will begin with an overview of services provided by the university's external audit firm, which is Deloitte. A summary of those services is included on page 6. Deloitte completed several routine audit and attest engagements related to fiscal year 21. This included the audit of the university's annual statement, various compliance audits, as well as an audit of Rumenko. Attest procedures were also completed for the NCAA reports for both Twin Cities and Duluth campuses. And the total billed amounts for these engagements was $607,200. This was about $22,000 under budget. Throughout each of these engagements, the Controller's Office works closely with Deloitte during the year to ensure planning has been completed, which supports a smooth and efficient audit process. All engagement letters are reviewed by the Controller's Office, typically by myself and Controller Paulson. Throughout the engagement process, we hold regular meetings to discuss progress as well as address any questions as they arise. At the conclusion of the engagements, we also meet to debrief on the audit process. This allows us to identify opportunities for enhancing the current processes. It also allows us to get in front of any new or emerging issues related to the university's financial reporting process for the coming year. It also provides us with an opportunity to celebrate our successes from the current year as well. In addition to the annual one non-audit service, and this was related to certain consent procedures related to the university's bond offerings. We found that Deloitte's performance was excellent, and they continue to be a great partner in supporting the university's financial reporting process. In addition to the engagements completed by Deloitte, there are 5 other external audit firms that provided services to the university. This included a SOC 2 examination for the University of Minnesota Center for Farm Financial Management's FinPac tool, and that work was completed by Clifton Larson Allen. Ernst & Young was also engaged for various tax consultation services. The CPB requires an audit of KUMD, and that work is completed by the firm Esterbrooks, Scott, Signorelli, Peterson, Smithson. And an HR advisory engagement was completed with KPMG. Again, the Controller's Office is involved with reviewing all the contracts associated with these engagements, and they have not resulted in any matters of impairment. At this time, I will open it up to the committee for any questions or suggestions regarding the information I've shared.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions from members in the boardroom?
Nobody in the boardroom, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you. Any other closing remarks you'd like to add on?
No.
All right, good. I wasn't baiting you. We don't necessarily want to hear from you, Mr. Volma. No, I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And thank you for the presentation. Thank you very much. Okay. With that, we'll move on to the third agenda item. Remember, we switched the order, and that will be monitoring for policy compliance university-wide. Chief Compliance Officer Boyd Coomer is joining us via Zoom. Chief Auditor Galswick, would you like to provide some framing remarks before I turn it over to Mr. Coomer?
Yes, thank you, Chair Kenyanya. I thought before our Chief Compliance Officer begins this presentation, I'd provide a little bit of context on where I see policy monitoring fit into the larger control framework for the institution. So a common misconception is that internal audit is the monitoring function for the university. But by Institute of Internal Audit Standards and by how we operate, we really see ourselves as the third line of defense, with the first line of defense being the individuals and units that are performing controls throughout the institution to make sure that risks are managed. The second line is the monitoring and the support that the administration provides to ensure that those controls are in place. So what Chief Compliance Officer Coomer is going to be talking about today is really that second line of defense, the assurance that the administration is providing that the controls are operating effectively, while we as the third line of defense would be looking at confirming both those first and second lines are operational. So with that context, and without further ado, I'll turn it over to Chief Compliance Officer Coomer. With your permission, Chair Kenyanya.
Of course, Mr. Coomer.
Thank you, Chair Kenyanya and members of the committee. And I do not see the presentation on the Zoom screen. So if we could, oh, thank you. Perfect. If we could go to the second slide. So with today's presentation, I will start off by defining two key terms, and then I will discuss the importance of monitoring policy compliance and how doing so helps to inform policy owners regarding the effectiveness of policies. During this presentation, I will also cover policy owner responsibilities related to monitoring policy compliance. Next slide, please. So policy compliance, and I want to make the distinction between policy compliance and policy effectiveness. Policy compliance refers to how well covered individuals conform to a policy's requirements. It's that simple. But policy effectiveness refers to how well a policy is achieving its intended outcome, and that can take some analysis on the part of the policy owner. Next slide, please. So why monitor for policy compliance? This is a question that my office manages the university's policy management program, as well as the compliance program, is asked quite often. So the response is that monitoring provides information that would not otherwise be available. Examining this information is just one step in determining if the policy is working as intended. Sometimes policies can have unintended effects, and monitoring for policy compliance is one of the ways that these unintended effects can be discovered and then proactive solutions implemented. Next slide. So not all policy noncompliance is intentional, and sometimes policy owners don't fully understand a policy's requirement and are unaware that they are out of compliance because of that knowledge deficit. This can happen when, for example, terms of art change since the policy was written, or when a policy no longer fits the organization it was originally intended to fit into. And so recognizing these issues does create an opportunity for the policy owner to strengthen the policy impact and address weaknesses. Next slide, please. So the requirement to monitor policies for compliance and effectiveness is established in university policy. It's that important that we have a policy dedicated speaking to policies. We call it our policy on policies, although it has a different actual type. And so we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. So Quinn mentioned the 3 lines of defense model. In this model, policy owners and other unit managers have the first line responsibility to own and manage risk associated with their policies and with other day-to-day activities. The university policy establishing administrative policies requires that policy owners periodically review and monitor their policies for compliance and effectiveness. Second line of defense functions, which includes the university's compliance program, facilitate the identification and management of risk by providing compliance and oversight in the form of frameworks, policies, tools, and techniques to support risk and compliance management. Next slide, please. So the elements of a policy can be monitored in 2 ways, and these include active and passive monitoring. Both types are deliberate. Sometimes when people see the term passive monitoring, they think, well, it's not as rigorous, and that isn't necessarily the case. Both of these take planning, are a very intentional effort. So with active monitoring, you do have more structure in that it is performed on a schedule using predefined data samples. This monitoring strategy is often used where failure to comply carries a very high risk associated with it. Or it's also used in monitoring strategies where data is readily available. And so the data is there, and good proactive managers say, well, we should be looking at it if it's so easy to get to and understand it. Active monitoring is often, but not always, automated. That data availability in those circumstances lends itself often to automation. Now, a passive monitoring strategy, again, still planned out, still a strategy, but is one that relies on a triggering event to kick off a monitoring review. This strategy is often used on elements of a policy where there's a low transaction rate, for example, and so the event is where that triggering event comes from when you do have a transaction, or where accessing the data necessary for the review can in itself be disruptive or harmful in some way. Next. So to help our policy owners prepare for monitoring, we ask them to consider the likelihood of noncompliance with the policy. Things to consider when making an estimate of likelihood are their experience from past events. How often do they see transactions or difficulty with compliance? What is the complexity of the policy? And really, what is the number of policy users? And it's good for policy owners to just have a general feel for the likelihood that there's going to be a violation that policy. Next slide, please. We also asked policy owners to estimate what would be the impact of a typical compliance failure. So for example, would a typical failure impact somebody's health or safety? Would it have a significant financial impact on the university, harm the university's reputation? Would a typical failure impact a person, or would it impact a larger group of people? And these are all important factors to consider when determining your monitoring strategy as well. Next slide, please. We also asked policy owners to estimate we also encourage our policy owners to consider the driving forces behind the need for a policy. So generally speaking, the more an activity is externally regulated, the higher the are there policy requirements in the policy that are there to satisfy federal or state laws? Next slide, please. And so driving forces behind a policy can also apply to other external entities, such as a research funder. And a good example of that is the conflict of interest requirement by Public Health Services. Next slide, please. So a good example of an active monitoring strategy for a policy is the policy I mentioned earlier, establishing administrative policy. So this policy has 4 key requirements that we have an active monitoring plan for. The policy requires that the university board policies, administrative policies, and collegiate policies be in alignment, which makes sense of this information and requirement down. My office actively monitors that this alignment is occurring by methodically reviewing policies and working with stakeholders as needed if we find any type of misalignment. Policy owners are required in this policy to consult changes to their policy with appropriate stakeholder groups. Active monitoring for this, as well as a requirement that policy owners monitor their policies for compliance, is baked into our comprehensive review process. And comprehensive reviews happen on a regular cycle managed by the compliance office. It tracks and reports outcomes, reports those outcomes to senior leadership on a regular basis. Next slide, please. A good example of where a passive monitoring approach is applied to elements of a policy is a retaliation policy. This policy prohibits community members from retaliating against anyone who reports noncompliance or participates in an investigation of suspected noncompliance. These matters are often stressful for those involved, the reporter, the witnesses, the respondents. And a passive monitoring strategy that is used is to wait for a trigger event. So in this case, a report of retaliation to occur, and then the institution goes in, investigates the report to determine if non-compliance with this policy occurred and what steps are needed to mitigate it if there's a finding that there was retaliation. So you might be wondering when we're talking about active and passive monitoring, if a policy may have both active and passive monitoring plans in place. And that is absolutely correct. They can. And the retaliation policy is another good example of that. So while we wait for triggering events to go and do a deep dive and sort of reopen a matter, if you will, in terms of who was involved and the dynamics that might be playing into the retaliation, we also on a regular basis take a look at how many retaliation reports we've had in a given time frame and look for any trends that could be concerning where we would also want to intervene. So that part, because we do it on a regular set schedule, would be the active part versus the passive part that I just described. please. Our next slide, please. I'm sorry. So interpreting a policy compliance. So compliance with a policy may mean that, and this is where it takes often the subject matter expert, the policy owner, to really dig in and look for root causes of noncompliance. But it may mean that covered individuals are well on the policy requirement and procedures, which is the situation I think most of us would hope for. And that's why we have such great policy compliance. But it could also mean, depending on how the element needs to be monitored or how it can be monitored, that there's just low reporting of noncompliance. And so the policy owner needs to examine that to make sure that they recognize that that is the case. It could mean that the policy is clearly written, easy to understand, and just easy to follow. So if people have questions, they can turn to the policy and they're answered, and they go along the way in a policy compliant fashion. And that covered individuals are operating within a strong culture of compliance. Now, non-compliance with a policy could mean that there is just a need for additional training regarding the policy. The policy users don't fully understand the policy and procedures. And so that's where your non-compliance is coming from. It's back to that non-intentional non-compliance. There could be an increased reporting of non-compliance. So this happens often after awareness training, and this is a good thing. This is why we do awareness training, but often hand in hand with awareness training, we'll see a spike in non-compliance related to the topic of the training. But that's, I must say that's one of the goals for us to have better visibility into those issues. Non-compliance could mean that the policy is poorly written, hard to understand, or that there's difficult to follow elements that the policy owner needs to develop a strategy to mitigate those issues. Or that covered individuals are just not operating within what we would consider a strong culture of compliance, and following policies just isn't made a priority. Now, thankfully, that is a very rare thing, but it's something that the policy owner needs to be considered, and certainly something my office considers when we go in and do that second tier of defense look at policy monitoring. Next slide, please. And this just reiterates what the policy owner needs to do when they, with these findings, ask themselves, is additional training needed? Do we need to revise the policy? If there are unnecessarily burdensome requirements, is it possible to those in a way that makes compliance easier? And of course, that depends on the goals of the policy and whether they're driven by regulations or outside entities, but it's certainly something to consider. And then always reinforcing a culture of compliance is a good place to start as well. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about policy effectiveness. And I pointed out early in the presentation that policy compliance and policy effectiveness are not analogous to each other. So when we talk about policy effectiveness, again, we are referring to how well a policy is achieving its intended outcome. Policy compliance is one of several factors that a policy owner needs to take into account when assessing policy effectiveness. It's important for policy owners to also examine whether or not they are getting the outcomes that the policy was put in place to achieve, and then compare that outcomes assessment with the data they're seeing regarding policy or compliance with that policy. Understanding this will help policy owners develop strategies to improve their policies in order to get the outcomes they are seeking. So these last 4 bullet points, all of these scenarios are possible. You can have a high compliance rate with a policy and the desired outcome is being achieved. You can have a high compliance rate with the policy and But when you look at the outcomes that you were that the policy was intended to create, you're not seeing them. Compliance can be low, but still the required outcomes are there. The compliance can be low, and the desired outcomes are not there. So the policy really needs to dig deeper into why they're seeing those results. Next slide, please. So policy owners are expected to communicate their findings through their management structure so that action may be taken to reduce incidents of non-compliance. This could be targeted communication, discipline if it's warranted, again, that additional training. And this brings us back to the three lines of defense model, and policy owners and unit managers are that first line of defense, and their monitoring of policy compliance and engaging in appropriate follow-up is just a good business practice as well. Next slide, please. So the policy management program serves as a second line of defense function and provides that compliance oversight related to policy management. Part of that oversight includes a comprehensive review of policies every 4 to 6 years. In the comprehensive review process, policy owners are asked how their audience has been with the requirements and how that compares with previous years. Next slide. So the compliance program, also as a line of defense mechanism, adds additional policy compliance monitoring mechanism through the compliance risk review process. And for this committee in the past, I've done a presentation on the compliance risk review process. But CRRs are conducted by the Office of Institutional Compliance on specific compliance topics, for example, privacy management, lab safety, or clinical. And part of the compliance review process is to assess the adequacy of policy monitoring by asking the questions: how is compliance with the policy monitored? So we, as that second line of defense, ask the policy owners and the managers as that first line of defense how they're monitoring their policies, what the frequency of that monitoring is, and what typical non-compliance issues they find and how to correct them. The compliance program staff then work with stakeholders to develop strategies to close any identified gaps. Findings from compliance risk reviews are reported to senior leadership, and they are summarized for the Audit and Compliance Committee. I do that in my annual compliance report to this committee. And next slide. So thank you. That concludes my prepared remarks, and I'm happy to try to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Coomer, for the comprehensive presentation. As my colleagues gather their questions, I'll start it off. I mean, this is really helpful and a good overview of the program and the framework you use in evaluating the policies. With that being said, do you have any, are there themes you're noticing? You know, for example, you have that matrix with compliance versus desired outcomes and how those play out. You also talked about how you review how policies comply from a collegiate level to a campus level to university policy to board policy. Are there certain themes you're seeing there of what type of things are in compliance, or just any other observations from this program that you'd like to share with the board?
Thank you, Chair Kenyanya. Appreciate the question. Members of the committee, thank you. So I'd like to point out that we, in last year, in 2021, we completed a 2.5-year project to check alignment of policies between board, administrative, and collegiate. It was a pretty intensive effort on our director of the policy management program at the time, Michelle Gross, who's since retired, but again, she managed to do a complete alignment check. And over that 2.5-year period, and I would be unable to pull them off the top of my head what they were. There were only 4 issues where there was a misalignment, and they were fixed. So once they were recognized, it wasn't an issue correcting those misalignments. So I think that's good. People are looking up to board policy for guidance and direction when developing their policies. They're thoughtful, mindful, have to be in alignment with board and administrative policies all the way down to the collegiate level. So I think that's very, very positive. On the policy monitoring side for policy compliance, one of the challenges that we've had is bringing policy owners along to understand that monitoring a policy can start with the resources that you have available. Oftentimes, policy owners, and because they're so thoughtful and they want to make sure that everything's right, when they think of monitoring a policy, they think of the work that internal audit often does, where they go in and pull big samples and have statistically significant assurances about things. And really what we're asking the policy owners to do is have a plan in place to do, if you're active monitoring, to do routine checks of small samples, just so you can have a level of comfort that things are that policy are able to follow your policy. And the deeper dive that internal audit does is not what we're looking for from you. Your policy requirements, all of those factors that I mentioned, and have a simple plan in place. And then if you find that you have issues, then you can start looking into what else do we have to do? Do we have to have more and more robust monitoring? But it doesn't have to start that way. Some monitoring is better than no monitoring.
Thank you for the response. Do we have any questions from colleagues in the boardrooms? Ms. Flatten.
Regent Davenport.
Thank you. Regent Davenport.
Thank you, Chair Kenyanya and Mr. Kumar, for your presentation. Thinking of the culture of compliance here at the university, and on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate our culture of compliance?
Chair Kenyanya, thank you. Regent Davenport, thank you, members of the committee. So that's a really great question. And I don't think that there's an answer that I could give that's across the board for the institution. There's a really great model out there from our friends at New York. Trying to think of the university where this comes out of, but they talk about a compliance continuum, and you can be at different places along that compliance continuum at different places in your institution, even at different levels. President Gable sets a very strong tone at the top, right? She makes it clear that she has high expectations that we are going to be compliant with our policies, that we're going to have good policies in place that are going to be meaningful and impactful to the institution. And I believe that her senior leadership team carries that forward as well. But if we were to look across the institution and go in, depending on events that may have just recently happened in an area, or events in larger societal context, I think you're going to see some variance. All of that said, so I just want to make it clear that I'm not giving a blanket answer. I believe that we have a very strong culture of compliance in the institution. My experience since coming here is that when compliance goes in to do a compliance risk review, instead of there being sort of a wall put up, which I've have experienced at other institutions, while nobody's happy to see the compliance officer show up because he's a compliance officer, they're receptive and they listen. And then once we get into the program, once we get into it and they learn that it's really meant to be collaborative, that we're not doing the work to to penalize them, but we're doing the work because we want to help them be better, they typically get on board 100%.
Regent Davenport.
Thank you.
Thank you, Regent Davenport. Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Chief Compliance Officer Coomer. And right off of that question, in trying to kind of recognize, when the nervousness kind of arises and when there's sort of this collaborative process. My question goes to the challenge of being the hall monitor. I think, last I knew, the compliance was overseen by human beings, and human beings have relationships, and over time those things relationships can be significant and strong. How do you maintain that objectivity and independence among your team that conducts the compliance? I have a follow-up question to this, but I'm interested in in how you ensure that you're always getting an objective and independent perspective as this review goes on a continuing basis. If that isn't clear, I could try to clarify, but I'll let you answer.
Mr. Coomer.
Thank you, Chair Kenyanya, Regent Rocha, members of the committee. It's all about the process, and I think having an appropriately well-designed process in place is how you assure that independence. So when we perform a policy review, for example, the policy owners, when it's time for their review cycle, there's a matrix per their policy. It's not about the person who happens to own the policy at that time, but per the policy, what policy it is. There's a matrix of the groups that they need to consult with. Does it need to go to faculty? Who are their stakeholders? And so that's the first step, right? Is that whole consultation period process if we're talking about policy monitoring. Then when the policies go for review, so again, this is that second line of defense, my office's role in this. When the policies go for review, they go to committees. They go to the policy advisory committee. If there are significant changes with the policy, they go to the president's policy committee. So you get a committee's oversight versus one person's oversight. It works much in the same way with the compliance risk review process. If we are going to go into an area, even though the policy piece is one small component of that, we follow a framework. We build our monitoring tool based on the 7 elements of an effective compliance program. There's fairly standard questions that we may have to tailor a little bit each area, but that's our starting point. Is a tried and true template following the federal sentencing guideline requirements, and then we just go in and get those answers to the questions that we need to determine whether or not they're meeting those 7 elements.
Vice Chair Rocha.
Thank you, Chair Kenyanya. Just to follow up, thank you for that response. And it seems like it's a continuing process. And I really appreciated the presentation and how you walked through the different ways in which policy noncompliance may occur. And there's the massive distinction between intentional noncompliance and inadvertent noncompliance. How does your enterprise determine intentionality, and at what point in time would you come to a position where you would report an intentional versus non-intentional? Because it seems that obviously people could disagree. Somebody might think that it was unintentional, somebody might think it was intentional. How do you make that assessment as to whether there is intentional noncompliance versus inadvertent noncompliance?
Mr. Coomer.
Thank you, Chair Kenyanya, Regent Rocha, members of the committee. So when my office becomes involved, and I can speak to my process as the compliance officer and the compliance program's role in this, when we become involved in suspected misconduct, so a suspected policy violation, we utilize a committee, another group, small group, but another group made up of myself, our VP for HR, our chief compliance officer, and a senior associate general counsel to review what was reported to our office and determine where it needs to go within the institution for investigation. We triage it, but we require that investigator to report back to that group with their findings and any follow-up actions, if any, that were needed. This group reviews those findings, reviews those follow-up actions for due diligence and appropriateness. Disciplinary actions, for example, if they substantiate that there was non-compliance, that's an administrative function. So it's largely an HR decision and that administrator's decision. But again, because this consultative team has oversight of that, they will ask the question of, is this consistent with other cases? Like, I think really consistency is the key when we're talking about any sort of disciplinary action. So if somebody is in one area and they violate a policy intentionally, or I'm assuming that you're related, this is related to intentional non-compliance. If they intentionally violate a policy and somebody else in a different area intentionally violates the same policy in the same way, then there should be very similar actions taken. As far as my office's role, when we're involved in that, because the report of the policy violation came to us, we keep an eye out for any inconsistencies in how things are handled, and then push back and ask for consideration of what has been done in the past.
Thank you.
Thank you both. We'll turn to our final regent, as we do need to move on to the next item, Regent Swigum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I was really interested in Regent Davenport's question about the culture of compliance or non-compliance. And my perception is, and it's only a perception, is that we have a very, very much a culture of compliance here at the university to our policies. I'm going to assume when you have 26,000 employees and 7,000 students, there's always going to be people pushing the envelope or inadvertent non-compliance. Boyd, I assume with the non-compliance to policies that take place, most of it, whatever exists, is inadvertent, probably needing more training, which you referred to, maybe in some cases a slap on the hand. Boyd, what I need you to do from my perspective of being a regent and with the other regents is to keep us away from those non-compliance policy violations that reach the front page of the Star Tribune. There's different levels of non-compliance, inadvertent, advertent, some just obviously keep us away from the front page, if you would. From the headline.
Regent Swigum, was that just a comment?
Just a comment.
Okay, all right, appreciate it. Thank you very much. Thank you for the discussion and thank you for the presentation, Mr. Coomer. We do appreciate it. With that, we'll move on to our last item, which is item 2 in the agenda, enterprise risk management update and discussion, which has been an ongoing topic of discussion and a priority for the board. To facilitate that discussion, we have Vice President Catherine Bonison joining Chief Auditor Galswick. I see they're getting settled. When ready, I will hand it over to Chief Auditor Galswick.
Thank you, Chair Kenyanya, members of the committee.
I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today about the Enterprise Risk Management Program. I am here with Catherine Bonison, the head of our University Health and Safety and a member of the ERM task force since its inception. Agenda today, I will just be speaking to the first bullet here on internal audit's involvement with ERM and the engagement with the board related to ERM. I'll then turn it over to Catherine to talk through the initial Impact 2025 ERM charge, the recommended course of action, the status of the plan of implementation before she then opens it up for a larger discussion with the committee on to get your perspectives on ERM and this process on the early side as it's just initiating. So for the Office of Internal Audit's involvement, the main item I want to emphasize here is that I believe that ERM is appropriately housed as part of the administration. In other words, not part of internal audit. When ERM is functioning appropriately, I believe that it should be informed by the strategic plan and it should inform strategic decision-making that should be made by senior leadership in consultation with the board. Now, that being said, I believe internal audit can play a role with ERM, especially during the establishment of ERM, where we have a unique perspective on processes and risks throughout this institution by the nature of our role. That's why we're a member of the task force to help initiate it. And then once ERM is fully functioning, I would expect it to be a more mutually information sharing situation where we would look to ERM to inform where we should be spending our audit resources, the areas of greatest risk for the administration and the board. We'd be providing our results to the ERM function so that they have an understanding of where there may be issues or places where additional controls are needed, et cetera. As far as board engagement is concerned, the initial presentation on ERM was provided to the Finance and Operations Committee in December 2021. I think that's appropriate that given that this was spearheaded by the SVP for Finance and Operations, and obviously when ERM is fully functional, it'll have a large impact on the finance and operations of the institution. Now, that being said, we would propose moving forward that the oversight of the enterprise risk management function should be happening here in the Audit and Compliance Committee. That would be in alignment with board policy that explicitly notes that compliance initiatives and enterprise risk management processes will be overseen by this committee. If there's additional questions or comments on that, we can talk about that after the presentation is over. But with that, I will turn it over to Catherine to talk you through the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Quinn, and good morning. Thanks for having me. So as a refresher, December 2021, Senior Vice President Franz had a presentation to Finance and Ops around the Enterprise Risk Management Project, which is a piece partial of Impact 2025. The charge is listed on the slide. So in response to that charge, the work that's been done was we formed a task force, as Quinn mentioned, through the SVP's office and in conjunction with our system campus leadership. We also then reviewed previous university ERM work that's been done, which is fairly extensive. We also talked to a lot of peer institutions and what's working well, what are others doing. We didn't just look at higher ed, we also looked at industry to say, what are you doing in this realm? And it's changing very rapidly. And after we did that work, we pulled it all together and submitted sort of a final report recommendation to the president's office. Next slide, please. So in summary of what we learned from all of that work, which, 6 bullet points, it feels like it was a lot of work to get there, but the enterprise risk management, it's critical to efficiently manage risk across an institution our size and with our complexity. We heard loud and clear from those that we talked to that there really is no one size fits all. You just can't go and buy this off the shelf and implement it and expect to have, really positive results. We also heard loud and clear that leadership has to be on board. And we know that's true with our president, and we know that's true with our board. And so we're really excited to have this opportunity. That risk identification, it needs to be strategic. So you can't have this 40-something laundry list. It really needs to tie back to what is it of value in your institution? So what makes us successful here at the university, and how do we protect that, or how do we enhance that? And that each risk, it needs to be owned by somebody. Somebody needs to be responsible for that risk. And that the last piece was that you have to have a dedicated staff member to really manage an enterprise risk management program, someone that keeps this thing moving and flexible and alive and sustainable. So looking into 2022, where we are today, and that's why we wanted to make sure to give this update, is to check in sort of where we are. So we've issued the RFP. We have received about 10 bids, and we're in the process of reviewing those. We're very excited about the quality of the bids. We are looking at having someone on board fairly soon. So we will hire that consultant this late spring, early summer. And then the next piece that we would be going into once that consultant's on board is to create that sustainable consultative program and provide strategy direction to help us create an enterprise risk management system that pulls all the previous work together in a way that's very livable, high functioning system. So as a reminder, these are our current risk areas as identified in 2018, and they were on a 5-year cycle. So we are right about at the exact time to update and refresh these, and that'll be part of the work that the consultants will help us do. This is quite a large list. I looked through the list, and a number of them fall in my shop, which is probably why I was, volunteered to be up here today. So this was just more of a refresher, but this will also inform maybe some of our discussion questions, which is really where we want to spend our time today. So again, as I mentioned earlier, project status, we're up to date. We've submitted the plan to the president's office. We've issued the RFP. We're analyzing those results. We hope to have this consultant on board very quickly. So the meat of the presentation, and hopefully the discussion, was really we wanted to check in with board to see, are there things that you would like us to really pay attention to as we get into this next phase of work in terms of, are there stakeholders that are, maybe something that we wouldn't have thought of? I mean, to me, there's some of the obvious ones like the president's cabinet and those in, sort of high risk areas, public safety, or, in the provost shop or international programs. Some of those seem obvious, but, help us if there's things that maybe we're not seeing. What would success look like from your vantage point, when this is all implemented? Are there any specific risks or concerns that, are in the front of your mind that you want to make sure are addressed? And then we're also trying to think proactively of rephrasing this idea of risk management to not seem like it's managing a negative opportunity. That risk can really be positive. And managing it well helps the university stay on sort of the cutting edge of being innovative and on top of the game. So if we pause there, right, and that's where we're looking to hopefully get some feedback.
Thank you. Do you have any questions from colleagues at the Horseshoe?
Nobody in the boardroom, Mr. Chair.
All right, and I see no one on Zoom either. All right, I'll turn it back to you guys, and maybe questions will generate.
All right, so kind of moving forward, this is getting to the end of the presentation, is, the commitment from this project and this team is to ensure as we move forward that we include a broad range of stakeholders in the identification and ranking of risks. And this part can be fairly tricky because risks are important, but to be able to prioritize them and not to have a laundry list that's so large that you can't manage them effectively, we need a lot of stakeholders to be engaged in that conversation. We want to make sure we build off of previous efforts that the university has undertaken because that work is important. And we want to take some time to make sure we build a system that's unique and works for the University of Minnesota. And with that, I think that concludes any prepared remarks.
All right, Ms. Flatten, still no questions on that end?
We have Regent Rocha and Regent Davenport.
Okay.
Thank you. I'll defer to Regent Davenport.
Regent Davenport.
Thank you, Chair Kenyanya. I'm just curious about hiring a consultant. And this is a big, and I would think unique, but I suppose it's not so unique project. What are the attributes that you would look for in selecting the right consultant for this project?
Sure. Do you want to start with that one?
Sure. So I think one of the main attributes that we would want to see with the selection of a consultant, Regent Davenport, is making sure that they have higher education experience, specifically large research institutions. I think an enterprise risk function is much harder to establish in an institution that's as broad as we are with so many different risk areas, et cetera. Especially when you compare us to the private sector where, at the end of the day, the primary focus is going to be the profit margin, right? So we're thinking about things that impact profit. We don't have that same sort of focal point where we have a lot of different units, a lot of different places that have different perspectives on risk. So somebody who's able to help pull together those various risks and help to to elevate those so that we can discuss them and compare them when they're really coming from very different perspectives. Anything you'd add to that?
Thank you.
Regent Davenport, does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Vice Chair Rocha.
Thank you, Chair Kenyanya. I just didn't want to, have the opportunity to ask questions and the body not ask any. And I knew Regent Davenport would ask a better question than I would. When looking at like the current risk areas, some of these areas seem like they're really laden with subjective analysis. When you start talking about things like lobbying and political activities and the like, how do you set benchmarks for evaluating risk in highly subjective areas like that?
That's a great question. Appreciate it. Regent Rocha, I think that's part of the reason when we were working through this as a committee was the idea of talking to our peer institutions and realizing that we probably need a little bit of help from the consultant to figure out what are those right questions? What are those right benchmarks? Because there's always a continuum of risk. And what's how do you determine if you're in that right spot? Is that the appropriate place? Or are you too far to the right, too far to the left, or somewhere in the middle? So I don't have the exact answer, but to know we recognize that as a committee, that some of these are going to be a little easier to answer than others. So in my area, health and safety, we can look at things as number of workplace injuries. It's pretty black and white, but you're right, there are areas where it's not so black and white. So I think that some of the work that we'll be doing this summer by having, folks come in and help us identify how do you identify those right benchmarks, and what are other institutions with a portfolio like ours, how do they do it as well?
Yeah, the only thing I would add, Regent Rocha, is that something can be a risk that we can't necessarily fully manage or control for. And I think in those situations, we're going to have to be aware of those risks and be thinking about how we respond to those risks if they were to, result in some sort of negative impact. But it doesn't mean we can always manage those. And then there's other places, I think, if you look at this list, if you take cybersecurity, for example, you could put nearly infinite resources into it and then still have at least some level of risk, or you could put varying levels and accepting different levels. So I think there's going to be places where we're thinking through the risk in terms of how much investment do we want to make to reduce the risk. There's going to be places where we just simply can't fully manage that risk, and we have to think more about the response to various negative aspects. Does that make sense?
Vice Chair Rocha.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. That it absolutely does, and I appreciate that answer. If it just a bit of a follow-up, a little bit of a twist. It seems if you look over maybe the last decade or so in the internet age, we have sort of societal norms / interests change quite quickly. Where things that had sort of not been entirely prevalent, becoming the focus of everybody in terms of risk and what can, change the concern of the community and an environment, especially at a public institution. How do you prepare for that? I mean, I don't know to what extent you can, but if you're following sort of what is on the public's mind or what is sort of taken over the social consciousness of the world, if not our community, how do you prepare for that? Or are you more focused on, really we're going to look at these sort of objective criteria that have kind of historically been the areas of risk, and then leave those things for sort of special projects or special attention as they arise, if that makes sense?
Chief Auditor, very quickly. Yeah, VP Monson, go ahead briefly.
And yeah, thank you for the question, Vice Chair Rocha, and I'll take a stab at it and then we'll let Quinn. We look at it, in my mind, the way you would approach something that's kind of hard to hold on to like that is what do you do to be prepared and mitigate? And so for me, it's preparedness of making sure when those things happen, and they inevitably will, because people are, everything is live and current and being filmed and posted, and are we prepared to answer it? Are we prepared to manage the situation? And how do you mitigate being in those situations that are hard to step out of? And I think that's the work of ERM. Like Quinn said, you can't stop it, but you should be well positioned to manage it well. Well positioned to manage, in the best position to manage it well. No.
Yeah, if I may, just real briefly, what I would add to that is that ERM needs to be a living process. And I think that's what's important about making sure that we establish an ERM function that really is with a person who's responsible for ensuring that we are considering the changing risk landscape. we're updating what those risks might be, and that we're getting feedback from the administration and the board on where priorities may change. I fully expect that in 20 years from now, this list will be very different than it is today, or at least the priorities on that list will be very different than they are today. I think that's a healthy part of the ERM process.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you both for that discussion. I'll just close it out by saying, Chief Auditor Galswick, the timing works well on that. Earlier this week, you and I sat in the UMF Audit Committee and actually had the same discussion. Without getting into the content of their ERM process, I will say I really liked that format and the way they went through that process. So, I think coming back to a board with a an ERM summary, that kind of format I think would be very digestible for my colleagues and I. So just something to keep in mind as we go into that. Thank you, VP Bonison and Chief Auditor Galswick for the presentation. We are over on time, but all we have left is an information item. So I'll turn that back over to you, Chief Auditor.
Thank you, Chair Kenyanya. I'll just do it from here for simplicity reason.
Yeah.
So the one informational item in your docket materials is related to the contracting with an auditing firm up in Duluth to do a review for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting associated with KUMD. This is just part of the regular reporting function that happens whenever an auditing firm is contracted with by the university to this committee. There was no major concerns with compliance or independence with that.
All right. Any questions on that, Ms. Flatten?
Regent Rosha has a question.
Vice Chair Rosha.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Very quickly, I'm without looking at the docket. That sale has been completed of the station, and so is this a backward-looking process?
Chief
Chair
Auditor.
Kenyanya, yep, Chair Kenyanya, Regent Rosha. So I would maybe have to bring somebody else up to get into the specifics of what was reviewed here. Maybe, thank you, Mike.
Vice President Volna.
Thank you, Chair Kenyanya. Regent Rosha, yes, it's backward looking. And you're correct that the KUMD sale has been concluded, but because the audit is backward looking, we still have to do the audit for that period of time that we received federal funding while we owned it.
Thank you.
All right. And that's the last item, information item, Chief Auditor?
That's all I have.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. With that, we are adjourned, and I think we should be back at 9:15 for the Mission Fulfillment Committee. Thank you.